Hello and welcome to another edition of Local Heroes. Today we're on the Battleship Alabama in Mobile, Alabama, at Battleship Memorial Park. It's a fun-filled family destination that you don't want to miss. It's immersed in history, so bring your family and come see this historic ship. Today we're talking to Mr. Chuck Wheeler on Local Heroes. So stand by, come back, and you'll hear more of an interesting Local Heroes story. Welcome to Local Heroes here on WKFK TV7. Today we're coming to you from the Battleship Alabama in Battleship Memorial Park in Mobile. It's a fun-filled family destination, folks, and if you haven't been here, you really need to come see this. And if it's been a while since you've been here, you need to come back and see it again because you're going to enjoy it. On our last show, we talked to Mr. Chuck Wheeler, and we're going to talk to him some more today. Mr. Wheeler, you were on the USS Enterprise. The Enterprise was at Midway, was at Guadalcanal, and let's pick up your story from Guadalcanal. Did they actually want to send you ashore at Guadalcanal?
Send a what?
Did they want to send you ashore at Guadalcanal?
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay. Guadalcanal was hard. It was extremely hard for our Marines. It was hard for everybody. And at one time, they wanted some aviation ordnance people to go over to Guadalcanal, Henderson Field, to help load bombs, because now we had the Japanese on the run, so to speak, and they said we could use the help loading and unloading, working on dive bombers. So they picked a friend of mine by the name of Hagenbach and me, and said, you're going to go over to Guadalcanal and help them load bombs. Well, I knew that at Guadalcanal they had all the bugs that bite you, and they had all the creatures and dengue fever and all that other business, and I didn't want any part of it. So I thought, well, I don't know why they're picking me, but really the reason why they picked me, because I didn't get along too well with the chief in charge, and neither did Hagenbach, so he was going to get rid of us and send us up to Guadalcanal, which was the normal punishment for everybody. If you didn't do right and they had a chance to send you to Guadalcanal, then that's where you go. So once again, they give me a World War I metal battle helmet, and then they give me some boots, and they give me some leggings, and a 1903 Springfield rifle, and they give me a trench tool to dig foxholes with. And I thought, what am I going to do with all this business? I don't even know how to use it. And they give me a long bayonet to put on the end of the 1903 Springfield rifle. So here again, you got a sailor that doesn't know what he's doing. And fortunately, the general up at Guadalcanal, General Vandegrift, said, hey, don't send any more sailors, because I don't want to babysit them. They don't know what they're doing, and they'll get killed. Some Jap will cut their head off, and that'll be the end of it. So we didn't have to go. So now, as far as winning the war, I can well remember what the statistics were, because I look them up. People ask me over the years. We lost 24 of our first line cruisers, battleships, or not battleships, but cruisers and destroyers and carriers, train vessels, which would be like oilers and supply ships. We lost 24 ships fighting the battle at Guadalcanal. The Japanese, believe it or not, lost about the same. We killed a lot more Japanese than they ever killed Marines, by far. The advantage that we had, we could always replace whatever we lost. The Imperial Japanese Navy could not do this. So over at Guadalcanal, we wiped out the Japanese. Our Marines wiped them out. They were the top of the line troops that had gone all the way from the Philippines down into the Dutch East Indies and Burma, and all the way into into Guadalcanal and Tulagi. So they were hurting. We shot down many aircraft. Many of them were off the Zui-Koku and the Shokoku, and also the Japanese were very skillful with their land-based aircraft. Most of them were fighters at the time, and they had them what we called, it was called the slot. It was the waterway. It looked like a big water pathway from Guadalcanal and Tulagi all the way up to Bougainville, which was about 600 miles, and then it made a left turn and it went by Holandi on New Guinea, and then it went into the area where we were engaged in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Now, what makes it interesting in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, by the time that battle started, we probably had 10 aircraft for every one that the Japanese had. We probably had 16 or 17 aircraft carriers, counting the Jeep carriers and also our Essex class carriers, and they didn't have but 2 or 3. I think they had the Shokoku and the Zui-Koku and one more. So we wanted to set a trap for them because they were reluctant to come on out and fight us head on. They would have preferred a night battle with battleships because they were better than we were at night operations with their surface vessels, like their destroyers and torpedoes and their cruisers and battleships. So they wouldn't come out, and we had a light carrier, and it was called a Cabot. It was about 2 football fields long, about 85 foot wide, carried about 70 airplanes. So they took it up in the area off the Philippines, and they made out like it was damaged. They even hooked a tug to it and the line, and they were towing it to get the Japanese to come out and try to sink it. And believe it or not, they took the bait. And after they took the bait, now they were out there, and they brought some of their battleships, the Yamato and the Masashi. They had those those big battleships not in general area, but they were out there. They got to sea, and then they had their carriers, and they had some more some more of their battleships that they had when they blew us up at Pearl, and they brought the fleet out. And believe it or not, in one day, I believe the tally was something like we shot down over 365 of their first line pilots that they had left, and aircraft, and tore up their ships and sunk their cruisers, and really that was the end of the Japanese Navy. But they didn't have enough sense to know it, and too bad they didn't know it.
That was the turkey shoot.
Yes, yes sir, that was called the Mariana Turkey Shoot. And it had a bunch of ships in it from all kinds, and that's where Admiral McCain became famous, and Admiral Halsey, they picked on him because the typhoon showed up shortly after that, and they blamed him for getting in the typhoon, and then they had Admiral Fletcher was out there, and it was a good show. But it was lopsided and one-sided because, once again, the war was over for them. And it's too bad. Too bad they didn't know it, because we would have never dropped the bomb. And I was scheduled to go aboard a light cruiser carrier, which was like the Cabot. And our job would have been to invade Japan. And then after they dropped the bomb, they kind of put everything on hold. And then shortly thereafter, I don't remember what was a little bit before, a little bit after, but we had a Japanese Zero come on down, and he dropped his bomb and tore up our number 1 elevator, flew through the air, about 400 feet in the air, some of the guys said, and then we had no way we could fly off the carrier, so they turned around and sent us back to Pearl Harbor, and then from Pearl Harbor we had to go to Bremerton, Washington, and they fixed us up in Bremerton, Washington, And that's when I got off the ship at Bremerton, Washington. But she went back out to sea again, and then the war was over, and they brought her back to the Panama Canal. She went through the Panama Canal into New York, and they had a big, big celebration at New York, a war end celebration. And then she went to Europe, primarily England, and they loaded her up with guys coming home, old soldiers and whatnot. Guys coming home, they loaded her up. They had hundreds upon hundreds of cots on the hangar deck, and they brought our guys home. And then after the war, and this is a sad story, we wanted to get the Enterprise and turn her into a shrine like the Midway is out in San Diego. So we had established an Enterprise Association at the time, and some of the guys that were in this Enterprise Association went to the Pentagon, and they talked to the Secretary of the Navy, and his name was Gates. Admiral Halsey was on our side. Admiral Halsey helped us gather up some money. We put a campaign going. We had about $330,000. And then Admiral Halsey got sick and died, and that was the end of the campaign. So in the meantime, they went back up to see Secretary Gates, and they said, "How much do you want for the Enterprise?" And he said, $500,000. Well, you can't believe the ugly words that went through most all of our minds for Mr. Gates. So what did he do with it? Later on, the guys went back up to see him again, and he said, "I can't give it to you because we're going to have two carriers." He said, "We're building a new carrier. It's called CVN 65. It's a nuclear carrier." And he says, "If you don't have the money, then we'll scrap it." So he sold it to a scrapper up in Bayonne, New Jersey for about $250,000, and his name was, I think, Brown Marine. So that's the story of the Enterprise, really. And what a shame they didn't turn it into a museum.
Absolutely.
She only missed one battle of the entire war, and that was the Coral Sea battle. We were about 12 hours behind the Coral Sea battle. We were at sea. We were halfway at the time trying to get there, about halfway between Tonga Taboo and the Coral Sea. And Admiral Halsey got the word recall. Now, what the recall was all about was the fact that they knew the Japanese were going to blow up Midway. Try to occupy Midway. And Nimitz wanted all the carriers back to get ready to go to Midway. So he sent the recall out, and I had a close friend. His name was Barnhill, and he was up on the bridge at the time the message come in. And he said, "Admiral Halsey threw a fit, took his hat off, threw it on the deck, jumped up on top of it, and he cussed out Nimitz, and he cussed out King, and he cussed out everybody. And this is what he said: 'You can't win the war tied up to the carrier docks at Pearl Harbor.'"
I can believe that.
Yeah.
That sounds like him.
Yeah, so that's the story, my friend. The whole
We're going to have
ball
to
line.
take a short break right here, Mr. Wheeler.
All right.
And we'll be right back with more local heroes right after this. Welcome back to Local Heroes, coming to you today from the Battleship Alabama in Mobile at Battleship Memorial Park. We've been talking to Mr. Chuck Wheeler. Mr. Wheeler was on SPD's dive bombers. He was the rear seat gunner, and he was also an armor, and he was at the Battle of Midway. He was at Guadalcanal. He was at the Marianas Turkey Shoot. And we want to talk, Mr. Wheeler, now about a kamikaze that actually hit the Enterprise. But what makes this interesting is you actually have a piece of that kamikaze in your hand right now. So could you tell us that story about the kamikaze hitting the Enterprise?
Yes, sir. The skin of the Zero that crashed into the ship, they found it in the elevator pit because that's where they picked up his remains, as well as parts of the engine and the skin of the aircraft. It looks to me like it's duraluminum. It's pretty hard, like our skin was on our aircraft as well. Now here's the story about him and how skillful he was. And I tell you this because I would like to emphasize that before the war, we used to sit around and talk about going to war with the Imperial Japanese Navy. And our pilots, the pilots that were in our squadron, I would listen to them. Back in those days, sailors did more listening than they ever did talking to officers. And they'd say, well, if we ever go to war with the Japanese, the war will be over in a couple of months at the most, because those guys don't know how to fly airplanes. They're not skillful, and the airplanes are probably Mickey Mouse. And so, once again, they kind of wrote it off, really. But now I'd like to tell you about the kamikaze that blew up the #1 elevator and put the Enterprise out of commission. And if you'll think that the Enterprise was out there before the war, and we went through the entire war, all those battles, we took 13 bombs while I was aboard her. Nobody could sink us, but yet, and get us out of commission, but one Zero pilot flying with about like a 500-pound bomb dropped on us, and he's the one that put the Enterprise out of the war, so to speak. And this is the way he did it. We were under attack, and it was off of Okinawa. Everybody in the task force of battleships and cruisers and other carriers and ships were shooting at this guy. And they were a group of kamikaze pilots, and here they come. And he was pretty high. He was probably up at least 10,000 feet when he pushed over. And he weathered the storm, come on down, everybody missed him. And he overshot his target a little bit, and we'll say, here's the flight deck. And he come on down, and he realized that he was going to go too far in front of the flight deck when his bomb hit. So here's what he did. Now just think, he's flying probably a couple of 100 miles an hour anyway, and he had 500-pound bombs, we think it was, aboard his Zero. And he come on down, and he realized he was going to overshoot, so he pulled it on up like this, and he went into what we call a high-speed stall, and rolled the airplane over on his left wing and come back down upside down, and he went through the flight deck. On his airplane, he had the bomb, and the bomb had what we called an instantaneous fuse. After it hit, it would take about 2 or 3 1/100ths of a second before it blew up. So it had enough time to penetrate the hangar deck, which was a 2-inch steel deck. And then the hangar deck being down, and excuse me, in the hangar deck elevator, in the elevator where the big hydraulics would take the elevator up and move it down. So the elevator was up, but the elevator pit, as we call it, was open. So when he crashed, he wound up in the elevator pit, and that's when the bomb blew up. So all that force of the bomb went up, and when it did, it took the elevator and completely tore it away from the hydraulic uprights, and the thing flew through the air. And the guys that saw it, they said it went up in the air at least 400 feet, and it hit the water. And some of the guys that had been blown overboard off the Enterprise, they swam over to it, and they stayed on it and used it as a raft. And then finally, that was really the end of our operations, because we could not fly airplanes off the carrier anymore. And that's when they sent it back to Pearl and Bremerton, Washington. But just think how skillful that guy was. And all those years, everybody thought the Japanese are blind, bow-legged, buck teeth. They don't know how to fly airplanes. But it was a big difference.
But this in your hand right here is actually a piece of that aircraft that you retrieved as a souvenir. This piece right here.
Yeah. Okay, now the guy that went into the elevator was the hangar deck, or the flight deck bosun mate, and he was in charge of the flight deck. He was in charge of the plane pushers, the plane handlers, the gas crews, you name it. The only thing that he wasn't in charge of was the ordnanceman and the machinist mate, because they belonged to the squadrons. So he's the guy that went down into the elevator pit while it was still smoking and burning. And he's the guy that picked up what we have here. But there was also, and you won't find in the history books, the Japanese pilots all had a history of their life in their like a log book, and it had his name, his mother and father's name, when he graduated from flight school, the airplanes that he was qualified to fly, and he had a couple of pictures of his family, and he had a picture of his girlfriend, and he had a scarf on, one of the kamikaze scarves, and he was they said his name was Tomi Zai, but that was not his real name. That was the way it looked like when our Japanese intelligence officer read the papers that he had on him, identification papers, and he had his pictures, and it was quite a packet of identification and information. So what they did to it, with it, when I say these are the powers to be on the ship. They kept what we have here, and they kept part of the engine. They had part of the pistons in the engine and the rods, cylinder rods, but they took all his personal belongings, his pictures and whatnot, and they sent him back to his family, which I thought was the right thing to do.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's the story, and what is interesting to me is how skillful that guy was, and he was a flying chief petty officer.
Wow. Yeah. But we also have a piece of the parachute cord that came from the kamikaze pilot.
Well, the reason why, the difference between some of them wearing parachutes and some of them that were not wearing parachutes. This guy was not a designated kamikaze pilot. He was too skillful. And the designated kamikaze pilots, the ones that they interviewed right after the Mariana Turkey shoot. And that's when they organized the kamikaze group, and that's when they also had the Baka bomb. You know what?
Yes.
Okay, the Baka bomb was nothing more than a flying torpedo, or a flying bomb, I should say. So those guys were designated, and they were programmed to die. So why wear a parachute?
Why wear a parachute?
Yeah, but this guy was not a designated kamikaze pilot. He just made up his mind. Supposedly, nobody knows, but he just made up his mind that if he got over a carrier, he was going to sink it, blow it up, and that was not unusual for him. We picked up a Japanese Kate pilot and his crewman, This was in the Battle of Rennell, and we shot the Kate down, and we took the kamikaze pilot, the torpedo plane pilot, the Kate pilot, and his crewman. They brought him aboard the Enterprise, and the first thing he wanted to do, he wanted some way. He said he wants to kill his rear seat gunner because it's not honorable to be a prisoner of war. So they told him, you're not going to get anything, so they threw him in a brig. And he was in the brig, and my buddy was a Marine, was guarding the brig at the time when he was in there with his rear seat gunner, and he didn't want the rear seat gunner in there, and he started to kill him, choke him, and whatnot. And so they took the rear seat gunner, the listed personnel, took him out of there, and they put him in another portion of the brig. Well, that pilot started to scream and holler, waking everybody up at nighttime. So my own personal buddy, big strong boy, he had a Life magazine. That was a long time ago, Life magazine. And he also had some weights, lead weights. So he rolled the lead weights up in the magazine, and he went into that brig, and he beat that Japanese flight officer to where he couldn't even move, so to speak, and that shut him up so they could all go to sleep.
Mr. Wheeler, we've come to the end of our show.
Yeah.
But I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your service to our country. We all owe you guys a tremendous debt of gratitude. I want to thank you, sir, for my freedom today. So thank you for being here on Local Heroes.
Well, I certainly thank you. But as I tell everybody, there weren't no heroes out there. There were some heroic deeds, but it was our job.
Well, you did it well.
Yeah. Now that's the part I like the best.
Yes. Thank you for watching this edition of Local Heroes. Join us again next time for a very interesting story.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching this edition of Local Heroes here on WKFK DTV7, where each week we bring you a story about a veteran, unedited, unchanged, and in their own words. So join me again next week here on WKFK DTV7, or visit our website at WKFK.com for archive shows about local heroes.